War is as old as humanity itself. Since the first man raised a stone against another, history has been written in blood, steel, and strategy. But amid the chaos of battlefields, moments emerge that transcend violence. Moments when the genius of a single commander changes the fate of entire nations. When logic conquers desperation. When the impossible bends to the will of one brilliant mind. This video isn't about ordinary battles. It's not about who had more soldiers, more swords, more cannons. It's about those who saw patterns where others saw ruins. About men who won wars before they ever drew their swords. Prepare yourself. These are the most brilliant military maneuvers in history, and each one changed the world. Before we dive into the twists and turns of the wars, hit the subscribe button and ring that notification bell. Because this channel is dedicated to showing you the fragments of history that cannot be forgotten. If you're fascinated by the stories that shaped our world, you're in the right place. Thermopylae, the ultimate last stand, the year for 80 BC, marked the zenith of Persian power. Xerxes, the king of kings, commanded the largest army the ancient world had ever seen, perhaps 1 million souls marching to crush the defiant Greek city-states. The Persians had already burned Athens. Greece seemed doomed. But at a narrow mountain pass called Thermopylae, King Leonidas of Sparta made a choice that would echo through eternity. With just 300 Spartans and a few thousand Greek allies, he would hold the pass against impossible odds. The genius wasn't in the numbers, it was in the terrain. Thermopylae, the hot gates, was barely wide enough for a few dozen men to fight side by side. Xerxes' vast army meant nothing if only a handful could engage at once. For 3 days, wave after wave of Persian elite crashed against the Spartan phalanx like waves against granite. The immortals, Xerxes' finest warriors, found themselves no match for bronze shields and iron discipline. Bodies piled so high that the living climbed over the dead to reach their doom. Leonidas had turned geography into his greatest weapon. The narrow pass nullified Persian superiority, reducing their million-man army to a few soldiers at a time. It was strategy in its purest form, using the battlefield itself as an ally. The end came through betrayal, not defeat. A Greek traitor showed the Persians a mountain path, surrounded and facing certain death. Leonidas dismissed his allies and prepared for the final act. Though the 300 fell, their sacrifice awakened Greece. The delay at Thermopylae allowed the Greek fleet to prepare for Salamis, where they would shatter Persian naval power. One small stand at a forgotten pass had changed the course of Western civilization. Cannae, the perfect trap, the 3rd century BC, was an age of titans. Rome and Carthage, the two greatest powers of the Mediterranean, were on a collision course. The First Punic War had ended decades earlier with Carthage's defeat and the loss of Sicily. But peace was fragile, and Carthaginian thirst for revenge burned in the ashes, while Rome consolidated its influence across the Italian peninsula. Carthage was reborn under a new dynasty of warriors, the Bacchus. At the heart of this lineage stood Hannibal, the general who, as a boy, had sworn eternal hatred of Rome at his father's altar. In 218 BC, Hannibal crossed the Alps with a multicultural army: Africans, Iberians, Gauls, Numidians, and even war elephants. After crushing Roman forces at Trebia and Lake Trasimeno, he marched south with growing fame and an aura of invincibility. Rome, enraged and humiliated, assembled its largest army in history, nearly 90,000 soldiers under 2 consuls, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro. They marched to find Hannibal near the small town of Carni in Apulia. Hannibal positioned his men in an apparently conventional formation, but the center was deliberately weak and bowed forward. On the flanks, he placed his best troops, disciplined African infantry, and lethal Numidian cavalry. The Romans, confident in their numerical superiority, formed a dense block of infantry, intending to smash through the Carthaginian center in one overwhelming movement. They wanted to crush Hannibal with brute force. But Hannibal's plan was the opposite: to use Roman momentum against them. As the Carthaginian center began to give way, the Romans advanced, diving deeper into the trap. Then the flanks moved like a predator's jaw, enveloping the Romans from both sides, while Numidian cavalry circled behind. In moments, 90,000 Roman soldiers were completely surrounded, pressed together without room to maneuver or breathe. The massacre began. An estimated 50,000 to 70,000 Romans died in a single day, the most devastating defeat in Roman military history. Alesia, the siege within a siege in 52 BC. The Roman Republic was expanding relentlessly, but enemies still resisted in distant regions. Gaul, modern-day François, vast, tribal, and proudly free. For decades, Rome had tried to dominate its forests, valleys, and people, but no resistance had been as fierce as that of Vercingetorix, the charismatic leader of the Aveni. With intelligence and charisma, he unified rival tribes against Roman domination. He was both the nightmare Julius Caesar feared and the challenge he needed for Caesar. Conquering Gaul wasn't just military duty, it was a springboard to absolute power in Rome. The war dragged on. Vercingetorix practiced scorched earth tactics, avoiding direct combat and attacking Roman supply lines, until he took refuge in the fortress of Alesia city, built atop a mountain. Surrounded by deep valleys, seemingly impenetrable. Caesar marched with 60,000 men. Vercingetorix had about 80,000 defenders. Moreover, tens of thousands of Gallic allies were coming to liberate the city. The numbers weren't in Rome's favor, but Caesar wouldn't retreat. He would besiege the fortress, then besiege those who came. To besiege him, Caesar knew attacking Alesia would be impossible. The terrain favored the Gauls, and any assault would result in a bloodbath. So he did the unthinkable. He ordered the construction of a complete siege line around the city, a wall over 15 kilometers long, with watchtowers, deep ditches, hidden traps, palisades, and sharpened stakes. But knowing reinforcements would come, he built a second line of fortifications facing outward, with over 20 kilometers of perimeter. Rome was now caught between two fronts: the enemy within, and the enemy coming from without. When Gallic reinforcements arrived, over 250,000 men, according to some sources, the battle became a perfect storm. Rome was besieged from outside, and inside, Caesar had less than half the enemy's soldiers, yet he held firm for days. The Gauls attacked the outer line, while Alesia's defenders attacked from within. The critical moment came when reinforcements breached the outer line. It seemed like the end, but Caesar, with cold blood and direct command, personally entered the field, reorganizing cavalry, redistributing troops, and launching a lightning counterattack at the exact point of rupture. The Gauls, exhausted and lacking cohesive leadership, broke. Vercingetorix surrendered the next day, walking to Caesar in full armor and casting his sword at the Romans' feet. Agincourt David versus Goliath in the mid-October 25th, 1415. The 100 Years' War had raged for decades, and England's young king, Henry V, had invaded France to press his claim to the French throne. But his campaign had gone disastrously wrong. Disease, had ravaged his army during the siege of Hafla. Food was scarce. Winter was approaching, with barely 6,000 men, most of them sick and exhausted. Henry was trying to reach the English-held port of Calais when a massive French army blocked his path near the village of Agincourt. The French had every advantage. Nearly 25,000 men, including the flower of French nobility knights in the finest armor, mounted on the best horses, backed by crossbowmen and men-at-arms. They were well-fed, well-equipped, and confident. Victory seemed inevitable. Henry's army was a pathetic sight by comparison. Mostly longbowmen commoners armed with simple yew-bows. Many were sick with dysentery, some fighting barefoot in the October mud. But Henry had something the French didn't: terrain awareness and tactical genius. The battlefield was a narrow strip between two woods, recently plowed and turned to thick mud by autumn rains. Henry positioned his archers on the flanks, protected by sharpened stakes. The French, contemptuous of common soldiers, planned a frontal cavalry charge to crush the English rabble. It was a catastrophic mistake. The heavy French cavalry charged across the muddy field, but their war horses became mired in the thick ground. The charge slowed to a crawl, and into this struggling mass, English longbowmen unleashed a storm of arrows. The longbow was the machine gun of medieval warfare, capable of 12 arrows per minute with devastating accuracy. Thousands of arrows darkened the sky, piercing armor, killing horses, and turning the proud French charge into a massacre. Knights fell into the mud, weighed down by their armor, unable to rise. English men-at-arms moved forward like executioners, finishing the helpless nobility with daggers and hammers. The cream of French chivalry drowned in mud and blood by day's end. Nearly 10,000 French lay dead, including 3 dukes, 5 counts, and over 1,500 knights. English losses, perhaps 400 men. Henry V had achieved the impossible, proving that tactics and terrain could triumph over numbers and nobility. Austerlitz, Napoleon's Masterpiece, December 2nd, 1805. Europe lived in constant warfare since the French Revolution. The old monarchies Austria, Russia, Prussia, and Britain watched in horror as a revolutionary general proclaimed himself Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. The Third Coalition, formed by the Austrian Empire, Russian Empire, and United Kingdom, sought to crush Napoleon before he consolidated his dominion over continental Europe. But Napoleon was more than a commander. He was a visionary strategist. After a forced march across Central Europe, he positioned his troops near the town of Austerlitz in modern-day Czech Republic. With 73,000 men against about 90,000 allied Austro-Russian forces. But numbers didn't frighten him. Napoleon had architected not just a battle, but a trap. Before the confrontation, Napoleon sent deceptive messages and feigned insecurity. He deliberately withdrew troops from his right flank, leaving the Pratzen Heights, the highest point on the battlefield, apparently undefended. The Allied generals, confident and misinformed, fell into the trap. They planned a massive attack on the weakened flank, hoping to break the French line and crush the little emperor with numerical superiority. The plan seemed solid, but it was exactly what Napoleon wanted. On the morning of December 2nd, under thick fog, the Allies began their attack. The mist concealed movements, and Napoleon waited. When most of the Allied army had shifted to attack the French right flank, Napoleon launched his true stroke lightning attack on the enemy center, exactly where the enemy army had weakened. Itself, the Pratzen Heights, now unguarded, was seized by the French. With them, Napoleon split the Allied army in two, cutting their communication lines and collapsing their structure. From there, the French enveloped the disorganized flanks, launched heavy cavalry, and transformed a successful ambush into a controlled massacre. Over 30,000 Austro-Russian soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. The Austrian army was dismantled. The Russians fled eastward. Emperor Francis II was forced to sign the Treaty of Pressburg, ending his participation in the Third Coalition. With this victory, Napoleon not only secured French supremacy in continental Europe, he dismantled the Holy Roman Empire, an institution that had existed for nearly 1,000 years. Austerlitz became the ultimate symbol of Napoleonic military genius, so perfect in execution that even his enemies would study his tactics. For centuries, Stalingrad, hell on earth, in 1942, the world lay under the shadow of war. The Nazi war machine seemed invincible. In just 3 years, Hitler had dominated almost all of Western Europe and bent the East to the gates of the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the USSR, begun in 1941, shocked the world with its speed and brutality. The Red Army retreated. Thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured. Cities burned. Moscow itself was threatened. But Stalin, as implacable as Russian soil, refused to yield. And in the south, on the banks of the Volga, stood a city bearing the Soviet leader's own name, Stalingrad. Hitler wanted more than strategic victory, he wanted symbolic triumph. Taking the city that bore Stalin's name would be a devastating moral blow and open the path to the Caucasus oil fields. In August 1942, the Luftwaffe began massive bombardment of Stalingrad. The city became rubble, but instead of weakening resistance, the ruins gave defenders a perfect labyrinth for guerrilla warfare and ambushes. Stalin had ordered not one step backward. Soviet soldiers, knowing there was no retreat possible, transformed every ruin into a bastion. While Germans expected quick conquest, they found an urban nightmare where every floor, every basement, every staircase was a deadly trench. General Zhukov, commander of the 62nd Army, organized merciless defense. Hand-to-hand combat with bayonets, improvised grenades, even bricks. There was no front line, only chaos. Meanwhile, General Zhukov, one of the USSR's greatest strategists, prepared his masterpiece, a counter-offensive that would change the wars. In November 1942, under Russia's cutting winter cold, Zhukov launched Operation Uranus. While Marshal Paulus and the German Sixth Army were trapped inside Stalingrad, the Soviets attacked the flanks, defended by less prepared and equipped Italian, Romanian, and Hungarian troops. The encirclement closed like an iron fist. Over 300,000 Axis soldiers were surrounded amid the city's ruins. Hitler ordered, "Stay and fight to the end." Paulus requested permission to retreat, denied. Nazi hope was reduced to planes dropping supplies amid the ice. But the sky was dominated by Soviets, and men froze from hunger. In January 1943, fate was sealed. Paulus surrendered with the survivors, the first German field marshal in history to surrender alive. The shame was so great that Hitler declared him a traitor. The Battle of Stalingrad lasted almost 200 days and left about 2 million dead, wounded, and missing. It was more than a battle. It was the beginning of the end of Nazi hegemony. D-Day, the greatest gamble, June 6, 1944. After years of devastating war, the fate of Europe hung in the balance. Hitler's fortress Europe stretched from Norway to the Pyrenees, protected by the Atlantic Wall, a massive line of fortifications. Along the French coast, But across the English Channel, the greatest invasion force in history was preparing to strike. Operation Overlord would be the largest amphibious assault ever attempted, involving over 150,000 men, 5,000 ships, and 11,000 aircraft. The stakes couldn't be higher. Failure would mean years more of war, possibly Nazi victory. Success would open the Second Front. Stalin had been demanding and begin the liberation of Western Europe. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, faced an impossible decision. The weather was terrible, the seas rough, but delay might mean losing the element of surprise. At 4 a.m. on June 5th, he made the call that would change history. Okay, we'll go. The genius of D-Day lay not just in its scale, but in its deception. Operation Fortitude had convinced the Germans that the main invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the Channel. Instead, the Allies chose Normandy, a longer crossing, but less heavily defended. As dawn broke on June 6th, the largest naval armada in history approached the Norman coast. Paratroopers had already landed in the dark, seizing key bridges and disrupting German communications. Now came the moment of truth. On Omaha Beach, American forces faced a killing field. German machine guns swept the beach from fortified positions. Men fell by the hundreds in the first minutes. The landing seemed doomed, but individual acts of heroism turned the tide. Soldiers advanced, meter by bloody meter, using the beach obstacles as cover at Utah. Juneau, Gold, and Sword beaches, Allied forces pushed inland with fewer casualties but equal determination. By nightfall, over 150,000 men were ashore, despite fierce German resistance. The Atlantic Wall had been breached. Within days, artificial harbors called mulberries were providing supplies to the beachhead. Within weeks, Cherbourg fell. Within months, Paris was liberated. D-Day wasn't just a military victory, it was a triumph of logistics, intelligence, and human courage. The successful landing opened the road to Berlin and marked the beginning of Nazi Germany's final collapse. Hitler's fortress Europe had been cracked, and through that crack poured the armies that would restore freedom to a continent. Throughout the centuries, thousands of battles have been fought, but few entered history not just for the blood spilled, but for the intelligence behind the blade. From Thermopylae to D-Day, what we witnessed were not mere confrontations, they were eternal lessons in strategy, courage, and vision. Because winning a war isn't just about destroying the enemy, it's about deceiving them, surrounding them, disorienting them, and in the end, leaving them in awe of the genius that defeated them. These 7 battles prove that the greatest victories belong not to the strongest armies, but to the most brilliant minds. When courage meets strategy, when preparation meets opportunity, when genius meets the moment, history is made. The past belongs to the victors, but eternity belongs to those who won with their minds. History remembers the bold, but it immortalizes the brilliant.